She always believed that love was fairy tale and marriage should be the happily ever after that everyone ought to have. But what she didn't also know or plan for was the baggage that sometimes came with it. Mandy stared at her wedding dress and knew that she was making the right choice. She was in love with Ken and they had been seeing each other for 2 years. Ken was caring, attentive, loving, and a proper gentleman. When he proposed, Mandy didn't have to think twice before saying yes to him. And now that they were finally making it official, she could feel the butterflies in her stomach. Mandy was the romance, novel, or movie kind of girl. She always allowed herself to dwell in the fantasy of a fairy tale ending, which was contrary to what everyone around her advised. They tried to tell her to get out of her bubbles, but Mandy paid no attention. She believed that the kind of love she read in novels and watched in movies were real, and that someday she would also experience it. Mandy refused to settle for less. So, when Ken came along, he was just the Prince Charming that Mandy had been waiting for all her life. Their relationship had never had to suffer chaos or fights. Some people felt that it wasn't normal, that they never had a fight, but Mandy was quick to tell them that her relationship with Ken was everything she ever dreamed of. Mandy could still remember the romantic proposal that Ken pulled off for her. The memory would forever be etched in her mind, but this morning was for saying "I do" to Ken and going home as his wife, and Mandy could barely wait. A few hours after that, her father led her down the aisle to meet Ken, who was handsomely dressed in a suit. His mother was seated in the front row with some of Ken's groomsmen. Mandy thought that she would take the second row with her parents and some other invited guests, but apparently, the woman wanted to be on the front row by all means. Mandy, the lover girl, had already planned her wedding. As a matter of fact, because she wanted everything to be perfect, she made every single plan herself, and one of them was that the front row would be occupied by Ken's groomsmen and her bridesmaids. That way, their pictures would come out beautifully perfect and in uniform. So you can imagine Mandy's surprise when she saw Ken's mother gallantly seated in front. While the pastor read out the sermon, Mandy used the opportunity to ask Ken why his mother was sitting in front, especially as he already knew what she wanted. She would have asked her best friend who made the seating arrangement, but she was seated somewhere in the crowd, and Mandy couldn't get across to her right away, and she didn't have the patience to wait until after the church wedding. Besides, the photographers were already on standby, ready to start taking pictures, so the last thing that she needed was for her carefully planned wedding to be ruined. "Why is your mom sitting in the front?" Mandy asked Ken in a whisper, so that no one would hear her voice. Ken explained to Mandy that his mother insisted that she wanted to be at the front so that she would see and hear everything that was happening. Mandy argued that the seating arrangement still would have given her that chance. Even her father, who led her through the aisle, took the second row as instructed. Why must Ken's mother be different? He was almost getting into an argument, and so Ken pleaded with Mandy to let it go. It was just a sitting position and nothing more. He told her not to make a fuss of it, and he also reminded her that all eyes were on them. If she continued to insist, people would think that they were fighting just before saying "I do." Ken was right, but it didn't mean that Mandy was happy about it. Unfortunately, there was nothing she could do about it. So, Ken's mother ended up sitting in front all through the church wedding, and Mandy saying "I do" with a tight smile because she was still displeased. She really hated it when her carefully thought out plans were ruined for no reason. After the wedding, Mandy noticed how overly active Ken's mother was during the reception. She wanted to control the food vendors and people in charge of souvenirs, as well as the ushers. After they had all been told what to do, Ken's mother went to them and instilled her own choices and patterns, making Mandy more displeased. Mandy had to send her best friend to Ken's mother to kindly ask her to stop interrupting the order of things. But she came back with the report that Ken's mother insisted that it was her son's wedding, and she had every right to ensure that things were going the right way. More like things should be going her own way. Ken didn't help matters. When Mandy told him, he urged her calmly not to dwell on it. It was their wedding reception, and they shouldn't let anything ruin it. Mandy already had a fairy tale wedding in her head. She had dreamed about it for weeks, but all thanks to Ken's mother, she spent the entire part of her wedding day displeased and unhappy. After the wedding, Mandy and Ken went to a resort that they had booked and spent the entire weekend there for their honeymoon, and Mandy felt happy again. As they drove back home to officially begin life as a newly wedded couple, Mandy looked forward to a home of peace and laughter with Ken. It was the first time that she would be living with him, and she was already anticipating what it would feel like. Well, until they arrived at Ken's house, and guess who they found there? His mother, Rosemary. Subscribe for more interesting and entertaining stories. Mandy was surprised and confused at the same time. The last thing she was expecting was to return to her new home after her honeymoon with Ken to find his mother. Rosemary, who knew that Mandy and Ken were returning that day, had gone through the stress of making something sumptuous for them to eat, and so Mandy couldn't complain about what seemed like a nice and thoughtful gesture. Also, she couldn't just ask Ken what his mother was doing in their matrimonial home immediately. So, Mandy forced a smile and welcomed her mother-in-law. After changing into something else, they both returned to the dining table to eat her food. Later that night, Mandy told Ken that she didn't have any idea that his mother was visiting right after their wedding. Her own parents had returned to their state, and she had thought that it would be the same for Ken's mother. Ken explained to Mandy that being the only child of his widowed mother, she might not want to be alone all by herself. Then Mandy asked how long they would be hosting her, hoping that Ken would say that it was only for a couple of days. But Ken burst Mandy's bubbles when he said that his mother would be living with them permanently. Unfortunately, she couldn't oppose to it because it would make it seem like she was a bad wife, especially as Ken already explained that she didn't want to be lonely and alone in her hometown. As early as 5 a.m. the next morning, Rosemary was knocking on their door already, and the first question that she asked Mandy was why she was still sleeping at this time of the morning, instead of being in the kitchen to make breakfast for her husband, Ken, who was also her son. Mandy expected Ken to stand up for her and say that it was too early and he wasn't hungry, but Ken said nothing. Grumpily, Mandy had to drag herself out of the bedroom to the kitchen. She instructed Mandy to make moi moi from scratch. Mandy was shocked. She tried to tell Rosemary that it would take time and Ken would be late for work, but Rosemary insisted that it had to be moi moi. Worse, Mandy would have to make it the local way instead of using a blender. For more than 25 years, I made moi moi from scratch for Ken every single morning because it is exactly what he loves and wants. Ken grew up eating fresh and well-cooked home meals. You are not going to change that for him, Rosemary insisted, left with no choice and not wanting to get into a fight with her mother-in-law when it wasn't even bright in the morning yet. Mandy got to work. She picked the beans and soaked them for a few minutes. Then she spent over 15 minutes washing the beans until there were no dirt left. When she was done with that, Mandy used the grinding stone that Rosemary had brought all the way from her hometown to grind the beans until it became smooth. Rosemary told Mandy that it must be smooth and moist because that was exactly how Ken liked it. She refused to give Mandy some breathing space because she stayed right in the kitchen with Mandy and supervised what she was doing. She also tried to control Mandy by telling her what to do. By the time Mandy was done grinding the beans, she was already sweating profusely and her palms were hurting because she wasn't used to it. Rosemary assured her that she would get used to it with time. After that, Mandy put the blended momo in the fire to cook. She tried to get some rest while it cooked, but Rosemary just wouldn't let her be. Rosemary called her a lazy wife who couldn't even make breakfast for her husband without getting tired. She had expected that Mandy would begin to do some cleaning while she waited for the moi moi to get cooked instead of trying to rest her head, even though it was in the kitchen. Didn't you sleep at night? Why do you want to sleep now after doing something as easy as making moi moi? What if it gets burnt? Rosemary asked authoritatively. This was the first morning that Mandy was waking up as Ken's wife in their matrimonial home, and yet Rosemary wouldn't give her some breathing space. Before Mandy got married to Ken, she had heard a lot of newly wedded women talk about how sweet the early marriage was. That was the time when they got to share a home with their husband before the children began to come, or even before they allowed any family members to visit. They also got to explore the house together and enjoy each other's company, just the two of them without any form of interruption. It was usually the stage where many couples considered the bonding stage between husband and wife, and Mandy had looked forward to this stage. But all thanks to Rosemary, she couldn't even get that on her first day. It was worse because Rosemary watched her like a hawk and supervised her as though she was on a school project. By the time the moment was cooked, Rosemary insisted on having a taste of it first before Mandy would serve it to her son. In her words, she didn't want Mandy to serve something that wasn't delicious to Ken, and if she didn't find it worthy enough, Mandy would have to start all over again. Rosemary's son deserved nothing but perfection. In all of this, Mandy never said a word. She wasn't happy, but she complied, and so she served some of it to Rosemary to have a taste as she demanded. Only when she was done that she allowed Mandy to serve it to Ken. But by the time Mandy took the food to Ken, he had already left for work that morning, making all her effort that morning. Mandy was very unhappy that after all the stress that she had been through, Ken didn't even wait to have a taste of it. However, it wasn't the worst part of Mandy's day, as Rosemary refused to let her be. Even though Ken had already gone to work and Mandy had done some cleaning while the mama was cooking on the fire, Rosemary still wanted Mandy to be actively working. She always found something for Mandy to do. It was either the toilet needed to be washed even when it wasn't dirty, or there was a speck of dust on the table that needed some wiping, or Ken had some dirty clothes that needed to be washed. Was Mandy expected to do every single thing? Ken had a good job that afforded him some level of comfort, and that was one of the things that had made Mandy accept to marry him. She grew up in an average home where chores weren't constantly forced down her throat. Unfortunately, Mandy realized that there were a lot of things that she never discussed or clarified with Ken, like their living arrangement and handling of chores. She had been too carried away by Ken's show of love and affection to even ask all these things, and Mandy had simply assumed that since Ken was a comfortable young man, she wouldn't need to subject herself to all of that. Little did Mandy know that her nemesis would come in form of Ken's mother. All through the day, Mandy was being forced to do something, and by the time it was evening, she was already exhausted to her bones. Mandy expected that Ken would have the moi he didn't eat in the morning, but Rosemary kicked hard against it. Her son would never return to stale food, so Mandy had to get into the kitchen and start cooking something else from scratch. Rosemary's choice of food was never the easiest. She didn't even give Mandy the opportunity to choose what she might like to cook for Ken, her husband. He is my son, and I raised him single-handedly for years. There is no way you will know him better than I do, Rosemary insisted. She didn't even care. She didn't even care if Mandy liked what she wanted her to cook for Ken. Anyway, Mandy obeyed and cooked something entirely different for Ken. He got back from work and ate everything up without seeing how displeased and exhausted Mandy was. At night, Mandy decided to use the only privacy that she had with her husband to narrate all that happened during the day and plead with Ken to talk to his mother to give her some breathing space. Mandy might not approve of Rosemary's presence in her matrimonial home, but if Rosemary simply stayed away from her and didn't try to control her, Mandy was sure that she could manage. Ken promised Mandy that he would speak to his mother. But guess what? He never did. The entire week, nothing changed. On the contrary, it became worse, making Mandy frustrated and almost losing her mind. Ken stopped listening to her. Whenever she tried to remind him about speaking to his mother because she didn't want to be disrespectful, Ken would complain about working too hard at the office and feeling very tired. For weeks, Mandy tried to communicate with Ken, but to no avail. She called her mother and complained, and her mother advised her to bear Rosemary's excesses. She is your husband's mother. You can't throw her out or disrespect her, Mandy's mother told her over the phone, and Mandy stopped calling her to complain. Everything changed one afternoon when Mandy overheard Rosemary on a call with one of her friends. Rosemary was bragging to her friend how well she was frustrating Mandy. From the conversation, Mandy realized that Rosemary never approved of Ken marrying her. She had kicked against it, but Ken had insisted, and so she had sworn that she would make life a living hell for Mandy, simply because she didn't like Mandy. Mandy's mouth fell open in shock. All this time, she had been according respect to a woman who had vowed to never stop doing what she was doing. It dawned on Mandy that no matter what she did, Rosemary would never have been impressed, and every day would have been worse than the previous day. Later that evening, Rosemary went to Mandy in her usual fashion and commanded Mandy to make pounded yam and vegetable soup for her son, Ken. Without saying a word, Mandy nodded like an obedient lizard. But she had a different plan in mind. In the kitchen, Mandy started to make jollof rice. Rosemary came into the kitchen and was shocked that Mandy was deliberately violating her orders. She also claimed that she didn't like jollof rice. But Mandy turned to her, and for the first time, Mandy stood up to her. Mandy told Rosemary that this was her matrimonial home and not Rosemary's, and as such, she was in charge and not the other way around. If Rosemary didn't feel like having what she was making for her little family, then she was welcome to go to bed in an empty stomach. Rosemary shouted, almost bringing down the roof. The first thing she did was repeat Mandy's words to Ken as soon as he got back. Ken, on the other hand, told Mandy to be more respectful. Mandy realized that Ken would never stand up for her over his mother, which meant that she would be the only one to fight for herself. Mandy pretended that she had heard, but after Ken left the next morning, she continued disobeying all of Rosemary's orders. If Rosemary wanted her to clean, Mandy would choose that moment to polish her nails. If Rosemary declared that it was time for Mandy to make lunch for her, Mandy would choose that moment to visit the salon or somewhere else. Mandy stopped being the obedient and peacekeeping daughter-in-law to Rosemary. Like, drop a comment and subscribe for more interesting and entertaining stories. The more Mandy disobeyed, the more reports Rosemary made against her. It became so chaotic that sometimes Mandy shed tears. This was far from the home that she envisioned for herself. Ever since she married Ken and they got back from their honeymoon, Mandy had never had some moment of peace. She couldn't even complain to her friends because they would laugh at her and say that they did tell her that there was nothing like fairy tale in marriage. So, Mandy was left to deal with it all by herself. When Mandy saw that it was getting out of hand and even her stubbornness wasn't doing much, she decided to try another approach. This time around, it was out of desperation to get Rosemary to leave. Mandy no longer wanted Rosemary to stay away from her. She wanted her mother-in-law to leave her matrimonial home completely and return to her hometown. But how would she achieve that, seeing that she couldn't just ask her to leave? No amount of retaliation and rebellion had prompted Rosemary to pack her bags and leave. The woman was like a bone in Mandy's throat that she just couldn't get rid of. Eventually, Mandy came to a conclusion. She went to an old friend and paid him some money to dress as a prophet and then come to her home with some scary prophecy. The moment he saw money, he accepted to do it immediately. That evening, Mandy, Ken, and Rosemary were having dinner after Ken got back from work. The prophet arrived a while later and said that he had some prophecies for Ken and his household. He told them that he was led by the Spirit to come to them. One of the reasons that they ought to believe him was that he had no idea who they were. He merely showed up based on the leading of the Spirit. Ken gave him the go-ahead to say what he had come to say. And that was when he told them that Rosemary wasn't supposed to be living with them. She ought to be back in her hometown because living with her son might lead to tragic, unforeseen circumstances. Rosemary immediately said that the prophet was lying. She was quick to remind everyone that she raised Ken and that for more than 20 years, Ken lived under the same roof with her. So there was no way anything bad would happen to him now, simply because she lived with him. Rosemary even went as far as calling the police and a good pastor that she knew so that he would not only be evaluated, but also arrested for waltzing into their home and prophesying doom on them. Mandy was getting worried because if Rosemary succeeded in calling the police, then he would be caught and he might reveal that she was the one who paid him to do it. But much to her relief, he was able to come up with an excuse and leave immediately. Mandy was dejected. Her plan had failed woefully. But the situation was still glaring at her square in the face. How was she supposed to continue living with Rosemary like this? It would have been a different case if Rosemary was on visitation, but she wasn't. This woman was permanently living with them, and the whole chaotic retaliation wasn't working for Mandy. Rather, it was making her hate her marriage. She and Ken began to drift apart. Even during the weekends when Ken wasn't going to work, Rosemary would try as much as possible to steal his time. It was supposed to be the time that Mandy and Ken shared together as a couple, being that all week, Ken was always leaving for work very early and coming back in the evening. But with Rosemary in the picture, that would never happen. It was more painful because Ken didn't seem to notice that anything was wrong. Mandy ran out of what else she could do, but still, she didn't want to give Rosemary the satisfaction of leaving her marriage because that was Rosemary's plan all along. Mandy paid more attention to Rosemary and she realized further that Rosemary was saving Ken for the daughter of her best friend. Her hope was that Mandy would get tired and leave, and then Ken would be free for her best friend's daughter. Instead of Mandy to accept defeat and give Rosemary what she wanted, she would rather stay right there in her home. But Mandy began to act differently. During the day, Mandy rebelliously tried to act however she wanted. She watched the TV when she felt like and took herself out at any time of the day. Then, when it was time for Ken to return from work, Mandy would retire to the bedroom. No matter how hard Ken tried to wake her up, she would pretend to be sleeping. For 1 week, Mandy deliberately prevented herself from exchanging a single word with Ken. In the morning, she hurried out of bed before he woke up and avoided him until he left for work. It became so obvious that Ken couldn't ignore it any longer. Several times, he asked Mandy what the problem was, but Mandy kept mute. It was so intense that Ken had to take the day off just so that he would talk to Mandy, but she was unresponsive. Not even Ken professing his undying love for her made Mandy to change her mind. Eventually, Mandy left a note for Ken, telling him everything that has been going on and the plans his mother had. And she also made him understand in the note that as long as his mother lived with them, they would never go back to talking. and because Ken loved Mandy and wanted to remain married to her, Ken eventually asked his mother to return to their hometown with the promise of getting her a companion. Mandy and Ken now finally had the chance to enjoy their home alone and in peace. Subscribe and turn on your notification buttons to get more interesting and entertaining stories.